Hello English learners, this is Brandon Salo. Thank you for coming to my channel once again. Taking a little bit of a hiatus from making videos, and there were just some things that happened, in my family, so I needed to take a break. Very serious things, as they happen in life. So I've been doing a lot of thinking about what to talk about in terms of practicing your English conversation, things that you could talk about with other English learners that you might be practicing English with, or even other native speakers that you might be practicing English with, and that is critical thinking. And you might think, what does critical thinking actually have to do with learning English? How does it even apply? And the answer to that is relatively simple, but there's a lot of depth to it. Now, first of all, when we critically think amongst ourselves individually, we run a dialogue in our minds. So we are essentially communicating with ourselves using rhetoric and dialectic. Now, I would like to say that critical thinking rests on the foundation, or it could be, you could say, comes about from the 7 liberal arts and sciences. And I don't know if you know what those are, but most people don't. And the 7 liberal arts and sciences start with astronomy, geometry, arithmetic, and music. And then the next 3 were devised a little bit later in time. The first 4 that I had just mentioned, you could say, were coined by Pythagoras. And the last 3 are rhetoric, dialectic, and grammar. So, when we engage in critical thinking, when we engage in critical thought, and when we engage in a dialogue such as this with other people, we exercise all of these arts. You might think, well, I don't really know much about astronomy, or I'm not a musician. That's okay. Still, there are hints of all of these disciplines in just about everything that we do. Perhaps you could see rhythm when you look up to the cosmos. When you look up to the stars at night, you could see rhythm with the revolution of stars and the swirls. And with this, perhaps you can hear music as the celestial bodies traveling through space do create a frequency. Of course, this is all metaphor, but when we speak in terms of rhetoric, we are using metaphor. Now, the importance of critical thought isn't necessarily just to debate. It's not to exercise our own egos. It's not so that we can win in arguments and make other people feel like they are something less than us. Of course not. No. The purpose of critical thought is to grow in our understanding, and hopefully to help us reach the point to where we know how we don't really know anything there is. And of course this goes to many different philosophies, but I'm not going to go there today. No, the purpose of engaging in critical thought in terms of learning English is so that we practice the full capacity of the language that we are trying to learn. Of course, in this case, it's English. Now, we're trying to practice English a lot, right? So most of you have probably spent many hours in classes going over these grammar exercises, bit after bit, sheet after sheet, practicing the present perfect tense, present perfect continuous, where and how to use modal verbs. And this is important, because grammar is important. However, this is only one component to language. What is the ultimate goal to language? The goal ought to be to communicate. And how do we become adept communicators? Efficient communicators who speak concisely, who communicate their thoughts well and effectively. Well, we do this with critical thought, and we become good at it as a result of critical thinking. So the goal is to communicate. Yes, we need grammar to do that. But the metaphor that I like to use with my students is that of music. Now in music, we need technique. Of course we need technique to execute various passages in music, regardless of what instrument you play, guitar, piano, voice, clarinet. We need technique, of course, because we need to be able to manipulate our instrument and explore the facility of our instrument, and therefore we need a technical facility in order to do so. But what is the goal of music? It's the same as with language. With any other language, it is a language, but it's the same as with English or Chinese, Japanese, Spanish. The goal is to communicate. We're communicating without words in this case. And as we've seen in many situations, there are people who have amazing technique in music, but they don't play music well. There are people who don't have an amazing technical facility in their instrument, but yet somehow they seem to communicate emotionally what they're trying to communicate on their instrument. And the same is true with English. There are people who understand grammar very well, but yet they're not good communicators. But yet there are people who find themselves being able to communicate things, even if they're very abstract thoughts, but they can communicate these things using very simple terms, using very simple aspects of grammar. But yet when you give them an exercise in grammar, they don't perform so well. So let's say they don't pass their first or second certificate. Why is that? Well, this is because some people, in terms of English now, not with music, but this is because some people have a higher capacity for critical thinking. And there's only one way that you can exercise this, and it's by doing it. You must think critically in everything that you do. And some people just say, well, that's exhausting. Why would I spend so much of my time just thinking about these things? I don't enjoy doing that. It's uncomfortable. And that's kind of like the thought that's kind of the expression that people give me often. I'm very disappointed in this. I think it's a failure from academic institutions internationally. Even at university level, critical thinking is something that isn't lost, and if it is taught, it is often taught inappropriately, and it is often incredibly biased, partly because of the institution, which is intertwined with government, and partly due to the biases, whether they be political, religious, or individual, from that of the professor. And it's basically robbing the students of their opportunity to become better citizens on this planet. When we think critically, we think about ourselves internally, mentally. We think about our thoughts. We call that metacognating, the thought above the thought. So we're thinking about our thoughts, why we think the way we do, how we think the way we do, and perhaps what has influenced our thoughts as they are today. When we do that, we get a better understanding of ourselves. When we do that, we get a better understanding of how we make the decisions that we make. In turn, this encourages us to live a life that is more free, more individual, and at the same time more connected with everybody else. Now think about that. More free, more individual, and more connected with all of our surroundings. And perhaps that's something that in a world like that we live in today is most paramount. You see me in a park surrounded by nature, and, well, as much nature as you could get in Madrid. And of course you look at the trees and you say, yeah, they're just trees, but we couldn't live here without the trees. A world without trees is a world without humans. A world without flowers is a world without bees. A world without bees is a world without flowers, and a world without trees as well, and a world without humans. So somehow, everything on this planet seems to function together. If we think critically about this, it becomes more apparent to us, more fascinating, more interesting. I think at first what scares most people is that when we start to think critically, it becomes uncomfortable. We get this sensation of anxiety. And that's because we are all gifted with such complex brains. We have this unusual thing called imagination. Throughout imagination comes creativity, and through exercised creativity comes innovation. And throughout, innovation becomes the progress that we are all surrounded in on this planet. Whether it's a nice park, a megapolis of a city, such as Seoul, Korea, for example, or even something simple as a bicycle. These are all results of imagination. Now, the imagination could be quite uncomfortable at times. It becomes excessive. We start thinking of things that are irrational. And that is very uncomfortable. That's what creates the anxiety. And this is why I think most people like to avoid critical thought. And I think this is why many people are encouraged through outside means to avoid critical thought. Perhaps that, and because it prevents individuality and freedom, essentially. And of course, if you look at the way we dress, if you look at the phones that we buy, if you look at all the things that we consume and how we consume, an absence of critical thinking does work to promote many forms of consumerism. That's food for thought, right? One of my favorite philosophers, Alan Watts, makes many quotes about how we ought to think and our connection with this planet. But he said fear is excessive imagination. And I think that if we look at ourselves honestly and we look at the way that people think or demonstrate their thinking process around us, we'll see that this is the main reason why people don't like to think or use their imagination, is because we get this essence of fear, this essence of anxiety, and it's very uncomfortable. But yet it's natural at first to have these experiences. But once you've exercised this ability, which is innate in everybody, in every human being, once you've exercised this enough, there is no more fear. There only becomes the platform of rhetoric and dialectic. And those of you who don't know what dialectic is, it is logic. This is what I consider the most important way to practice language. This is what I feel is the most important way to practice intra-communication as well as inter-communication. Intra within the person and inter between people. This applies to every single language. And those of you who are coming from languages such as Chinese, Japanese, you'll notice that we use words much differently in English. And this shapes our culture. This shapes our behavior. And the way that we use words shapes the way that we think, and the way that we think shapes our reality. The way that we think shapes our beliefs, and then in turn our beliefs shape our reality. This is something incredibly important to consider, because many people who speak English as their first language demonstrate how they see the world through the way that they use language. And those of us who use language at an elementary level perhaps also think at an elementary level, and perhaps are more susceptible to marketing, to influence, to all of those things that have the potential to control our behavior. So the question that we ought to ask is, why are we learning another language to become better communicators? Why do we want to communicate in the first place? What are our motives? Okay? Most cases, so that we can have a better standard of living, because our current country or our current living situation isn't as comfortable as we want it to be, and that's fine. That's fine that we want to progress and do more. But we want to be aware of this. Critical thinking induces self-awareness. And self-awareness will teach us how we learn individually. So through critical thinking, we become better learners because we know what becomes more efficient for us. This is a lot to think about, I feel, perhaps for some of you. For some other of you, maybe you've already grasped this. And maybe you understand it very well. Critical thinking isn't something that you can only learn in school. Absolutely not. Some of the best critical thinkers I've met, or the most efficient or profound critical thinkers I've met, were people from countries that were much less developed than the United States. And these people did not have university degrees. So the truth is you don't need it. You don't need that to practice critical thinking. All truths, whatever they may be, if they exist, they are inherent in everybody. And everybody has the opportunity to access those truths from within. And this seems to be apparent in all philosophies, from mystics in India, to monks in Tibet, to philosophers in the West. They might articulate them slightly differently, but nonetheless, they all tend to imply that these are inherent truths that are available to everybody. And they're available to everybody from within. Critical thinking. We think about who we are, we think about our environment. All of my classes I ask people, do you know how many people are on this planet? Some people say 200 million, some people say 2 billion. Do you know how many people are on this planet? Do you know how many people are in your own country? It's not necessarily how many people are on this planet now alone, it's how many people are on this planet now and how many people were on this planet when you were a child. And how many people were on this planet when your parents were a child. Let's look at it like this. It took roughly 20,000 years for the human population to grow to 500 million people. But it took only the last 200 years to go from half a billion to almost 8 billion. Yes, some of you might look on Google and you'll say, well, it says about 7.2 billion. Let's just round up to 8 billion. We're growing, and I think that statistic is from 2015. Half a billion to 8 billion in 200 years. And then the previous 20,000 years, it was relatively stable. I'm not saying this to induce any type of fear, but I'm saying this because this is something that we ought to recognize as a global community, which we are all a part of now. We are all interconnected. I'm speaking to you from a country that is not my home country, and there's a good chance that you are watching this from the other side of the planet. So we are connected. We are connected digitally. Perhaps through quantum reasoning, we are connected through other means as well. So this is where I begin with my critical thought and my discussions with my classes. And perhaps it's where you could start with your conversations when you practice English. I don't know. Do you agree? Do you disagree? Why don't you leave me a comment below? I really appreciate you taking the time to watch this relatively long video and monologue of me talking about critical thinking and how it applies to learning language. Thank you for your time.